Haarlem, occupied Netherlands, October 1943. Victoria Fairchild pulled her worn coat tighter as she hurried through the narrow streets of Haarlem. The afternoon light was already fading, and she needed to be home before curfew. The Germans had grown increasingly strict in recent weeks. Rumors of Allied airmen being hidden by locals had put the entire town on edge. Her leather shoes clicked against the cobblestones as she turned onto Kruisstraat, nodding briefly to Mrs. Jansen, who stood in her doorway. The old woman's eyes held a warning. German officers were making rounds again. Victoria quickened her pace, the small parcel of turnips and a precious half-loaf of bread clutched tightly under her arm. Food was growing scarcer by the month. The sight of her father's bookshop, now closed and partially boarded up, sent a familiar pang through her chest. 3 years since his arrest for publishing anti-Nazi pamphlets, and still no word. Her mother had followed 6 months later, pneumonia taking her during that first brutal winter of occupation. At 26, Victoria found herself alone in the 3-story brick building, the bookshop below shuttered, the upstairs rooms too quiet. The sound of aircraft overhead made her flinch. Not bombers, reconnaissance perhaps. Victoria didn't look up as she slipped her key into the lock and hurried inside. She moved through the darkened bookshop, shelves still lined with volumes the Germans hadn't deemed worth confiscating, and made her way upstairs. She lit a single candle, electricity was rationed now, and set about preparing a meager dinner. As she sliced the turnips, a distant explosion rattled the windows. Victoria paused, knife suspended, counting silently. 1, 2, 3. When no subsequent blasts followed, she resumed her work. Just another down plane, probably miles away. 2 hours later, as Victoria sat knitting by candlelight, a sharp rap at her back door made her freeze. She set down her needles and moved cautiously to the window, peering through the blackout curtain. In the dim moonlight, she could make out the figure of Peter, her neighbor's 16-year-old son. "Miss Fairchild," he whispered urgently when she cracked open the door. "Please, we need your help." Behind him, 2 figures supported a third between them. Even in the darkness, she could see the man's head hanging limp, his uniform unfamiliar. "Who is this?" she hissed, though she already suspected. "British airman," Peter replied. "Shot down over the Polder. The Germans are searching for him. Mother says we cannot keep him, they checked our house last week." Victoria hesitated only briefly. "Bring him through the shop. Quickly." They carried the unconscious man through the darkened bookstore and into the back storeroom. Victoria pulled aside the heavy rug, revealing the trapdoor her father had built years ago to hide banned books. "Down here," she directed, lighting a lantern. "Mind his head on the ladder." The cellar was small but dry, with a narrow cot her father had placed there during the early days of occupation. "Just in case," he'd said, never specifying what case he meant. Now she understood. Once the airman was settled, Peter and his companion slipped away with promises to contact the resistance. Victoria knelt beside the cot, examining the stranger by lantern light. His face was streaked with dirt and blood from a cut above his right eyebrow. His breathing seemed steady, though labored. She guessed him to be around 30, with dark hair and several days' worth of stubble. His flight jacket bore the insignia of the Royal Air Force. Victoria cleaned his wound with precious water and a strip torn from an old sheet. As she worked, his eyes fluttered open, startlingly blue and immediately alert. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "Where am I?" His voice was rough, the accent unmistakably English. "You're safe," she whispered. "You're in Haarlem. Your plane was shot down." "My crew." Victoria shook her head. "I don't know. You were brought to me alone." He tried to sit up but fell back with a groan, his free hand going to his side. "You may have broken ribs," she said. "You need to rest." The man studied her face intently before relaxing his grip on her wrist. "Ian." "Flight Lieutenant Ian Sutherland." "Victoria Fairchild," she replied. "You can stay here until you're well enough to move. The resistance will help get you back to England. And if the Germans come, Victoria glanced toward the ceiling. They won't find you down here. But if they do... She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what happened to those caught harboring enemy personnel. You're risking a great deal, Miss Fairchild. Victoria, she corrected. And yes. But I've seen what happens when no one takes risks. Over the next 3 days, Victoria tended to Ian's injuries. His ribs were badly bruised but not broken, and the cut on his forehead began to heal cleanly. She brought him food from her own meager rations and books to pass the time. During her visits to the cellar, they spoke in hushed tones, sharing carefully measured pieces of themselves. She learned he had been a history teacher before the war, specializing in medieval architecture. He told her about his small flat in Oxford, his elderly mother in Sussex, and the Springer Spaniel he'd left with his sister. "What will you do when the war ends?" she asked on the third evening, sitting on a wooden stool beside his cot. Ian smiled faintly. "Go back to my dusty books and half-asleep students, I suppose. Though everything will be different now." "Everything already is different," Victoria said, her gaze drifting to the small cellar window, blackened with paint and dirt. "Sometimes I can hardly remember before." "Tell me about before," he said softly. So she did, about the bookshop bustling with customers, her father's passionate literary discussions, bicycle rides along the canals, music in the town square on summer evenings. Simple pleasures made precious by their absence. "Your English is remarkable," Ian noted. "My mother was English. From Brighton. She met my father when he was studying in London." On the fourth night, the air raid sirens wailed. Victoria hurried to the cellar to find Ian already standing, face tense. "You should take shelter," he said. "I am in a shelter," she replied, setting down the lantern. "This is the safest place in the house." They sat together on the cot as the distant thrum of bomber engines grew louder, followed by the crump of explosions. When a particularly close blast shook dust from the ceiling, Victoria flinched. Without speaking, Ian took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip steady. They remained that way, silent but connected, until the all-clear sounded an hour later. "Thank you," she said as she stood to leave, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. Ian looked up at her, still holding her hand. "No, Victoria." "Thank you." The next morning, Peter appeared at her back door with news. "The resistance can move him tomorrow night," he whispered. "They have papers and a route south." Victoria nodded, ignoring the sudden hollowness in her chest. "I'll tell him." When she descended to the cellar, Ian was reading one of her father's poetry books. He looked stronger now, the color returned to his face. "They're coming for you tomorrow," she said without preamble. "You'll be going south, then to the coast. Eventually back to England." Ian closed the book. "That's good news." "Yes," she agreed. "It's not safe for you to stay longer." "Or for you," he added quietly. That night, Victoria brought a small bottle of Geneva she'd been saving and 2 glasses. "A toast to your journey," she said, pouring modest amounts. They sat closer than necessary in the dim light, talking late into the night. Ian told her about his brief engagement before the war to a woman who couldn't bear the uncertainty of loving a serviceman. Victoria spoke of the suitor her father had favored, killed during the German invasion. "I've been thinking," Ian said after a pause, "about what happens after. When the Allies win, and they will win, Victoria." "After seems impossible to imagine," she replied. "Not to me. Not anymore." His eyes held hers. "When this is over, I'm coming back." Victoria shook her head. "You shouldn't make promises during wartime." "Is that what they say?" "That's what I say." Ian smiled. "Then I'll have to convince you otherwise." He reached up, his fingers gently tracing her cheek. Victoria knew she should pull away, protect herself from another inevitable loss, but instead she leaned into his touch. When he kissed her, it felt like permission to hope again, a dangerous, beautiful feeling she'd nearly forgotten. The following evening, Victoria prepared a small pack with food and a clean shirt of her father's that might fit Ian. When she brought it to the cellar, she found him standing beside the cot, fully dressed and alert. "It's time," she said, handing him the pack. Ian nodded, slinging it over his shoulder. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of unspoken words filling the small space between them. "Victoria, you should conserve your strength," she interrupted. "It will be a difficult journey." "Look at me," he said softly. She raised her eyes to his. "I meant what I said. When this war ends, I'll find my way back to this bookshop." Victoria felt tears threatening but forced them away. "The resistance contact will be here soon. We should go upstairs." They emerged from the cellar, and Victoria led him through the darkened bookshop to the back door. Outside, the night was moonless, perfect for clandestine movement. They waited in silence, standing close enough that their hands occasionally brushed. A soft whistle from the alley signaled the arrival of their contact. "That's them," Victoria whispered. Ian turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Write something for me," he said urgently. "Something to carry with me." Victoria hesitated only briefly before slipping back into the shop. She returned with a small volume of Keats, opening it to the flyleaf where she'd hastily written a few lines. She pressed it into his hands. "For luck," she said. Ian tucked the book inside his jacket, close to his heart. Then he kissed her once more, deeply and desperately, before stepping back. "This isn't goodbye," he promised. "It's just until." Victoria watched from the doorway as he disappeared into the darkness with the resistance fighter. Then she closed the door, leaned against it, and finally allowed her tears to fall. The winter of 1943 bled into 1944 with increasing hardship. Food grew scarcer, fuel nearly non-existent. Victoria kept the bookshop closed but occasionally traded books for potatoes or firewood. She continued her quiet work with the resistance, passing messages and sometimes sheltering people for a night or two in the cellar where Ian had stayed. She received one message from him, delivered by a resistance courier in February, a simple note saying only, "Made it. Remember, until I." She kept it beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, taking it out on the coldest nights when hope seemed most distant. In September, news of Operation Market Garden brought a surge of anticipation. Allied paratroopers landed not far from Haarlem, and for a few heady days, liberation seemed imminent. But the operation failed, and winter arrived with the Germans still firmly in control. The Hunger Winter, they later called it. Victoria survived on tulip bulbs and sugar beets, growing thinner as the rations dwindled to less than 500 calories per day. She burned her father's bookshelves for warmth, saving his most precious volumes for last. In April 1945, news came that Canadian forces were pushing toward Western Holland. By early May, German forces in the Netherlands surrendered. Victoria stood in the town square among her neighbors, watching Allied troops roll in, hardly able to believe the occupation was finally over. The aftermath brought chaos, celebration mixed with reckoning. Collaborators were publicly shamed, their heads shaved. Food aid arrived, though recovery would be slow. Through it all, Victoria waited, trying not to count days, trying not to expect anything. Summer came, and with it, gradual renewal. Victoria reopened the bookshop, though with a fraction of its former inventory. One sweltering July afternoon, as she was dusting the nearly empty shelves, the bell above the door jingled. She turned, a greeting on her lips, and froze. Ian stood in the doorway, thinner than she remembered but unmistakably himself. He wore a civilian suit, slightly too large for his frame, and held his hat in his hands. For a moment, neither moved, as if motion might shatter the reality of their reunion. "You're here," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "I promised," he replied simply. Victoria took a step forward, then another. "I didn't let myself believe." "I know." Ian closed the distance between them. "I carried your words with me. Through France, across the Channel, all the way back to Oxford." He reached inside his jacket and pulled out the small volume of Keats, now worn and water-stained. Victoria touched it gently, remembering what she had written on that desperate night. In this darkness, I found light. Whatever comes, remember this cellar held more than fear, it held us, suspended between war and peace, finding something true. It wasn't easy to get back, Ian continued. There's so much confusion still, so much rebuilding to be done. And your teaching position, she asked. Your life in England. My life is where I choose to make it, he answered. I've been offered work helping catalogue and recover stolen art and books throughout Europe. I thought, perhaps there might be a bookshop in Haarlem that could use some assistance rebuilding its collection. Victoria looked around at the half-empty shop, then back at Ian. It will take years to make things whole again. I know, he said, taking her hand. I'm counting on it. Outside, children played in streets no longer patrolled by soldiers. Somewhere, a radio played Dutch music for the first time in years. Victoria felt the warmth of Ian's hand in hers, solid and real, a bridge between what had been lost and what might yet be found. Until, she said softly, echoing his promise from that night in the cellar. Ian smiled, bringing her hand to his lips. No, he corrected gently. Now.